The truck bumped along a dusty road, trailing a plume of red dirt across the open plains of New Mexico. Inside, a young Japanese nurse gripped the edge of the bench with trembling fingers, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the barbed wire of the internment camp faded behind her. Two American soldiers rode in the front seat, but it was the man waiting outside the ranch gate that caught her attention. A cowboy, wide hat, sunburned arms, leather boots. He didn't salute. He didn't stare. He simply tipped his hat and said, "She sleeps in my house." The nurse froze. Her mouth went dry. Was this exile? Humiliation? A trick? What happened next left her stunned. The cowboy offered her a glass of lemonade. His wife folded fresh linen on a bed by the window. A young girl asked if she liked horses. This wasn't a cell. It was a home. And the war she thought she knew was suddenly more confusing than ever. The order came without warning. A folded slip of paper, delivered with military brevity, called her name alongside 6 others. They were to be transported. No explanation, no destination, just an instruction to gather their belongings by morning. For the young Japanese nurse, it felt like Judgment Day. The camp had become a strange rhythm: barbed wire, routines, thin soup, quiet dread. To be removed from it was not relief. It was terror. Rumors had long circulated that some women were handed over to American civilians for useful labor, a phrase heavy with implication. Some said it was a cover for humiliation. Others whispered about disappearances, about women who were never seen again. There was no script for what came next, no training that prepared her for what she might face outside the fence. She packed her blanket, her toothbrush, the letter she had never sent to her mother. Her hands shook as she tied the bundle. The program had been written into policy quietly, an experiment wrapped in the language of pragmatism. American ranches and farms, short on labor due to wartime enlistments, were permitted to request POW workers, men mostly, but occasionally women. Officials assured both sides it was legal under the Geneva Convention. Work was voluntary, non-military, compensated in small credits. But paper laws were cold comfort to the women called to leave. It didn't feel voluntary, and none of them had forgotten what surrender was supposed to mean in Bushido, a fate worse than death. Now they were being sent off, one by one, to unknown homes, alone. That last word echoed in their minds louder than the orders themselves. As the truck rolled past the guard post, silence gripped the group. No one spoke. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through golden plains dotted with cattle and mesquite. The land was open, unguarded, unthinkably vast compared to the rigid confines of the camp. Each mile added weight to their fear. They watched fences pass, barns, windmills, and strange silhouettes on horseback. The sky was too blue, too empty. This was not war. This was something else. One woman muttered a prayer. Another clutched her stomach, sick from fear more than motion. They had no idea what would greet them. When the truck stopped, dust spiraled around the wheels. A gate creaked open, and there, framed by sunlight, stood a man in denim and leather. A cowboy, unmistakably. A broad-brimmed hat shadowed his face. He didn't glare. He didn't leer. He nodded once to the soldiers, then turned to the Japanese nurse and said with a calm, quiet certainty, "She sleeps in my house." No interpreter was needed. The sentence landed like a blow. The soldiers seemed unbothered. One even chuckled, but the nurse's blood ran cold. Was this a handover? Was she now property? The cowboy's wife appeared next. Middle-aged, weather-worn, her apron still dusted with flour. She stepped forward, not with menace, but with a soft towel in her hands. "We'll show you the room," she said slowly, enunciating. The nurse followed in a daze. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of lemon polish and something baking. There was no cell, no chains, just furniture, a bookshelf, a pitcher of water beside a bed dressed in quilts. The woman pointed at it, then smiled gently. "Your room," she said. It was too much, too strange. The nurse stood frozen, her mind grasping for something familiar. Anything. But nothing made sense. Not the bed, not the scent of cinnamon, not the little girl peeking around the doorframe clutching a toy horse. The cowboy had gone to fetch feed for the animals. The wife returned to folding laundry. No one yelled, no one hit her. She sat on the edge of the bed, afraid even to exhale. By nightfall, the fear had not left, but something quieter crept in beside it. Bewilderment. The ranch was not soft. There were chores, expectations, but they had handed her a plate at dinner. A real plate, with beef stew and cornbread. They had given her space. And when the little girl asked, shyly, if she had ever seen a real horse before, the nurse found herself answering yes. Her voice cracked. The girl smiled, and suddenly nothing made sense. Back at camp, she had feared starvation, abuse, disgrace. Out here, none of those things arrived. Instead, she was met with something far more disorienting, decency, the kind that asked nothing in return. And as she sat on the porch that first night, watching the sun collapse over the plains in colors she didn't know existed, the nurse felt a strange pull in her chest. Not safety, not trust, but the very first flicker of something even more dangerous. Doubt. The room was too quiet. That was the first thing she noticed. The silence wasn't like the camp's silence, which was always pregnant with tension, the shuffle of boots outside the barracks, the distant bark of orders. This was silence like water, soft, still, surrounding. The door closed behind her with a muted click. She stood motionless, her bundle still in her arms, afraid that moving too quickly might reveal the trick. The space was small, but nothing about it felt provisional. A handmade quilt, pale blue with faded yellow stitching, lay smoothed over a wooden bed. A tiny bookshelf leaned against one wall. A rug rested underfoot, patterned, woven, clean. Light streamed through gauzy curtains that shifted in the late afternoon breeze, casting dancing shadows across a modest table. On it sat a glass of water and a book. The nurse stared at them as if they were coded messages from another planet. There was no cot, no barred window, no chain for her ankle. The cowboy's wife had simply shown her the room, gestured inside, and said, "Rest, dinner at 6. Then she'd left, leaving the nurse alone with this kindness. She didn't know what to do with her hands. Her fingers twitched to fold the blanket, to stand at attention, to obey something. But no command came. After a long moment, she stepped closer and touched the bed with the back of her hand. It was warm from the sun. The shock of it struck harder than any slap. She sat slowly, clutching her bundle to her chest, her back straight, posture locked, her whole body braced against the possibility of humiliation. But it didn't come. Outside the window she could see horses grazing, tails flicking lazily in the golden light. The field beyond the paddock stretched endlessly, dotted with thistles and rust-colored grass. She could not make sense of it. How could this be her prison? It was the little things that broke her first. Not violence, but gentleness. A bar of soap resting on the folded towel in the washroom. A basket of bread wrapped in cloth on the kitchen counter. The sound of a harmonica drifting faintly from the porch after supper. Each one chipped away at something inside her she hadn't known was brittle. During dinner, the cowboy chewed slowly, politely. His wife passed her a second helping. No one spoke loudly. No one stared. The little girl chattered about a horse named Daisy and asked if the nurse liked the color green. She nodded. It was all she could manage. Later that night she lay under the quilt, eyes wide open. The pillow smelled of lavender and starch. She had not had a pillow in months, not since before the Pacific, not since the bombing raids, the wounded men, the retreat. She thought of the camp's thin mats, the women curled like animals on splintered floors. She remembered the cracked bowls, the half-scoop of rice, the way the guards never made eye contact. And now, here she was, tucked into softness, full from a meal she hadn't earned, listening too. The creak of porch boards as someone walked past outside, unhurried, unafraid. She turned her head toward the window. Moonlight painted the curtains silver. The air smelled of cornbread and cattle and dust. She could not sleep. Her body rested, but her mind screamed. Was this the beginning of something worse? Was the kindness a trap, a softening before betrayal? What kind of enemy builds a bed for a prisoner? What kind of captor teaches a child to say good night in broken Japanese? She remembered the officer who had slapped her for falling asleep during a briefing, the medic who had refused her treatment when she collapsed, the voice during training that had told them surrender was a fate for cowards. She whispered their names in the dark, trying to anchor herself to something, but even their cruelty felt distant now, less real than the sound of crickets chirping just beyond the window. When the wind stirred the curtain again, she sat up, hand to her chest. It was not fear that kept her awake. It was confusion, a deeper, quieter disorientation than she had ever known. The camp had rules, harsh but predictable. This house, this bed, this warmth, offered no such clarity. It offered something far more dangerous, the possibility that she was being seen, not as a tool or a body or a prisoner, but as a person. And that idea, more than any locked gate or uniformed guard, kept her trembling into the night. The next morning she was still awake when sunlight touched the windowsill. The air smelled of earth and coffee. She rose slowly, folded the blanket as instinct dictated, and stood in the corner, waiting for orders that never came. Instead, a soft knock. When the door creaked open, it wasn't the cowboy or his wife. It was their daughter. She couldn't have been more than 10, her red hair in wild braids, freckles dusted across her nose like pollen. She held something in her hand and grinned as if she'd known the nurse forever. "Hi," she said brightly, her accent thick and curious. "Do you like horses?" The question landed like a pebble in still water. The nurse stared at her, stunned by the ease, by the assumption that this was safe, that this was normal. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Yes," she said finally, the word thick on her tongue. It was the first English she'd spoken in days. From that moment on, the girl became a shadow. She appeared at the door with questions. What was her name? Did she know how to make rice balls? What was the sea like in Japan? The nurse, still unsure of her place in this strange world, answered carefully at first. Her English was poor, clumsy, halting. But the girl didn't mind. She giggled at the nurse's mispronunciations and repeated words until the syllables came easier. "You talk funny," she said once, matter-of-factly, then added, "but I like it." It was the innocence that shattered her. No fear, no suspicion, no shame in being seen with the enemy. The girl asked to braid her hair. She brought flowers picked from the edge of the fence. She gave the nurse a drawing, crayons on notebook paper, of a horse with wings and a smiling sun. "It's you," she said proudly, pointing to a stick figure with black hair flying on the horse's back. The nurse blinked, unsure how to react. No one had drawn her before. No one had ever imagined her flying. They sat together at lunch, eating biscuits and beans. The girl talked endlessly about her pony, about her favorite candy, about a dream she had where her school turned into a castle. The nurse listened, nodding, letting the rhythm of the child's voice wash over her like music. She began to answer with more than a word, then a sentence, then, slowly, stories. She told the girl about the sakura trees outside her school in Kyoto, about her brother's bamboo flute, about how her mother used to hang laundry in the garden. Her words were broken, but the girl's eyes stayed wide with wonder. One afternoon, the girl pressed something into her hand, a green ribbon, soft and fraying at the ends. "For your hair," she said. "Green looks nice on you." The nurse's throat closed. She bowed instinctively, the old etiquette rising like reflex, and the girl laughed. "You don't have to do that," she said. "We're friends." Friends. That word echoed louder than any command she had received in the army. She wanted to correct her, to say that prisoners don't have friends, that enemies don't braid each other's hair. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she tied the ribbon around her braid and smiled. Something shifted in her that day, not dramatically, but undeniably. She began to notice what wasn't happening. No one avoided her eyes. No one locked their doors. No one watched her eat. She realized with a slow, dawning clarity that she was not feared in this house. She was not despised. She was not even resented. She was here, present, seen. It was a quiet revelation, but it ran deeper than any wound, because it meant that something her country had taught her all her life, that the world would never forgive, never accept, never love someone like her, might not be true. And if that lie could be undone, what else might be waiting to fall apart? It was a warm afternoon when the cowboy's wife placed a small stack of lined paper and a freshly sharpened pencil on the kitchen table. "You can write home," she said gently, almost as if offering medicine. "We'll have it sent through the Red Cross." The nurse blinked at the paper, then at the pencil. It was yellow, smooth, ordinary. Her fingers hovered above it like it might burn. Write home? What home? And how could she explain what this place was, what it wasn't? She sat down slowly, the chair creaking under her weight. The kitchen smelled of cornbread and soap. Outside, the little girl's laughter rose and fell like music. She stared at the paper. Her hand trembled. "Dear Mother." The words came in her mind but froze on her tongue. Could she write the truth? That she slept on clean sheets and ate eggs with salt? That no one had screamed at her in weeks? That a child had given her a ribbon and called her friend? It felt like betrayal. Back in Japan, she had watched women weep from hunger. Rations had shrunk to nothing. Even soldiers were splitting scraps, surviving on rice soaked in water, sometimes on bark. She had seen children chewing paper to ease the ache in their stomachs. Her mother, thin and tired, had waved goodbye the day she left for duty, eyes proud but afraid. What would she think of this place, this strange, inverted world where a prisoner of war could feel warm and full and even, sometimes, safe? She finally picked up the pencil. The first words were small, almost invisible. "Mother, I am alive." She paused. Already that felt dangerous, like a confession. "I live with a cowboy's family." She wrote the words slowly, carefully. She didn't know how else to explain them. There were no words in their language for this kind of captivity. It was not punishment. It was not freedom. It was something in between, and it terrified her. "They are kind. I do not understand it. I sleep in a bed. I eat with them. They have a daughter. She gives me flowers." She stopped again, staring at the pencil. Would this letter ever reach Japan? Would it be burned by censors, dismissed as a lie? Or worse, what if it did arrive, and her mother read these words while kneeling over a fire with nothing to cook? What if her family thought she had abandoned them in comfort? She folded the paper but didn't seal it. She laid it next to her bundle on the small table in her room, unsure if she would ever hand it over. It felt too heavy, too honest, too full of things she couldn't yet say aloud. In the days that followed, she caught herself adapting to this life faster than she expected. She started waking before the rooster. She swept the porch. She learned how to mix flour with lard to make biscuits. She caught her reflection in the window one morning, hair brushed, face full, and didn't recognize herself. Was it really this easy, to be kindled back into humanity? It frightened her how quickly her body accepted comfort, how quickly her mind reached for peace. She had expected to resist. She had prepared herself to fight, in silence if not in action. But the truth was harder. The truth was, she liked the sound of the piano in the parlor. She liked the smell of sun-dried sheets. And sometimes, when the little girl slipped her a drawing, or the cowboy nodded to her at breakfast like she was a neighbor instead of a prisoner, she felt something more dangerous than weakness. She felt hope. Hope was not supposed to live behind barbed wire. One evening she took the letter and added one last sentence. "I think they believe I am human." Then she folded it carefully and placed it back on the table. She did not give it to the cowboy's wife. Not yet. But the act of writing it had already done something irreversible. It had given shape to a new kind of ache, not for escape, not even for home, but for understanding, for clarity in a war that had blurred everything she thought she knew. The next morning the cowboy handed her a bucket and pointed to the barn. "Feed first," he said, smiling beneath the brim of his hat. She took the bucket with both hands, instinctively lowering her gaze in deference. But his tone hadn't been commanding. It had been routine, like telling a neighbor where to find the sugar. The barn door creaked open, letting in dust and the smell of hay, leather, and animals. Inside, the horses shuffled and snorted, their massive frames somehow gentle. She approached slowly, cautiously, waiting for one to rear or kick. Instead, a dark mare nudged her arm, eyes soft, patient. The labor was familiar but different. It wasn't punishment. No guard stood behind her with a stick. No clock ticked with menace. She worked alongside the cowboy, who showed her how to hold the reins, how to speak low and slow so the animals didn't spook. His hands were rough, his manner quiet. He said little. But when she got it right, when the saddle fit just so or the pail was filled without spilling, he nodded with something close to pride. Later the wife led her to the kitchen. "Knead," she said, pressing her palms into dough. "Like this." The nurse copied the motion, her hands unfamiliar with softness. It was the same motion she'd used to press the chests of dying men during the worst months of the war. Repetitive, rhythmic, desperate. Now it folded air into bread, warmth into hunger. She didn't speak as she worked, but something in her loosened with each press. Day by day the chores multiplied: gather the eggs, wipe the porch, shake out the rugs, water the garden. Nothing was forced, nothing demanded. They simply assumed she would help. And she did, because it made sense, because it made her make sense again. There was order in it, comfort in knowing what the next hour held. At the camp, time was a weapon. Here, it was a rhythm. It moved with the sun, with the bleating of goats, with the whistle of the kettle. One morning, the little girl pressed a paper envelope into her hand. "For you," she said. Inside were seeds, tiny, weightless. "Mama said you can plant your own spot, your corner." The nurse didn't speak. She didn't know how. Instead, she walked out to the edge of the garden and knelt beside the soil. She stared at the dirt for a long time, unsure if she had the right. Then she pressed her fingers into the earth, dug a shallow line, and began to plant. She had once been told her duty was to die with honor, that her body belonged to the empire, that surrender was shame. But here she was, on foreign land, planting something meant to live. The contradiction made her chest ache. Each morning she visited the plot. The seeds were slow to sprout, but so was she. At first, it was just habit, a new task to mark the hours. But then a tiny green stem pushed through the dirt, stubborn and alive. She knelt beside it, fingertips hovering above the shoot like she might break it just by breathing, and that was when she understood. This was not just labor, this was not just kindness, this was growth. Quiet, undeserved, terrifying growth. She was changing, against all training, against all orders, against everything war had carved into her bones. She still wore the same clothes, still answered to the girl, still carried the weight of her uniform like a second skin. But she was no longer numb. The soil had woken something in her. The horse's breath had warmed something long cold, and every time she saw the little girl's drawing on her nightstand, still taped there, curling at the corners, she remembered. Someone in this house saw her as more than a prisoner. The garden grew. So did the ache. So did the fear. Because the more she softened, the more she knew. One day she would have to leave this place, and she no longer knew how to return to the person she was before. The radio clicked on with a pop and a low hum of static, just like it did every evening after supper. The family gathered in the living room, an old woven couch, a rocking chair, the girl perched cross-legged on a rug that had seen better days. The nurse sat in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, always unsure if she was meant to listen or simply watch. At first, she couldn't understand the words spilling from the box. The English came too fast, too idiomatic, blurring into sound. But the music, twangy Western ballads, sometimes sweet, sometimes sorrowful, she began to hum those. The melodies sank deep, tugging at emotions she hadn't named in years. Then one night, it changed. The voice on the radio shifted tone. The static cleared. The announcer mentioned the Pacific, Leyte Gulf, a name, familiar, distant, and then heavy casualties on both sides, Japanese forces retreating, brothers fighting to the last. Her breath caught in her chest. The cowboy's hand reached for the dial, but not fast enough. The room had gone still. The little girl blinked and looked from her father to the radio, then to the nurse. The announcer droned on, casualties, strategy, movement, words that meant bodies, meant brothers, meant the possibility that someone she loved had already died beneath a foreign sun. The cowboy lowered the volume. Not off, just down, and then he looked at her. Not coldly, not with accusation, just looked, like he saw something in her eyes he recognized, even if he didn't understand the language behind it. No one spoke, and in that silence she felt something shift again. They knew. Of course they knew. The war wasn't just a thing happening somewhere else. These people lost sons, too, cousins, friends. The cowboy might have had a nephew stationed somewhere in the Pacific, maybe even fighting near her home. His wife might have cried over telegrams in that very kitchen, yet they had never asked her why she was there, never demanded explanations, never made her account for the uniform she once wore. She sat frozen as the radio kept playing. Another song now, quieter, something about a prairie wind. The nurse's thoughts weren't on the melody, they were on the faces of her comrades, on the wounded she had failed to save. On the night she escaped a bombing raid by hiding beneath the bodies of her friends. On her mother's last words, "Be strong, make Japan proud." But here, in this strange room with its patchwork furniture and flickering lamplight, strength no longer looked like silence. It looked like surviving, and surviving felt, suddenly, like a betrayal. The next day she scrubbed the floor until her hands bled. No one had asked her to. She needed to feel pain, needed to atone for the comfort of a warm bed, for the loaf of bread she had helped bake, for the child's laughter that still echoed in her ears. She didn't deserve this peace, not while others screamed in tunnels or died nameless in far-off jungles. And yet, every evening the radio returned. Sometimes the news was trivial: farm prices, weather reports, songs about lonesome cowboys. But sometimes there was war, always war. She began to understand more. Each phrase cut a little deeper. Each map described a place she'd seen in smoke and fire. Still, they never asked her to explain, never blamed her, never punished her with silence. And somehow that made the guilt worse, because the war wasn't over. Not yet. Not for them. Not for her. But in this house, the war had been given a boundary. It lived inside the radio, contained, narrated, distant. And she lived outside of it, planting seeds, braiding hair, folding linen. Until one day she heard the word Hiroshima, and the room went quiet again. But this time no one looked at her. No one had to. Because by then she already knew some wounds don't bleed. They bloom, silent and unseen, like something planted deep that only grows when no one is watching. The drawer stuck slightly when she pulled it, just enough to make her tug harder. She was dusting the parlor shelves, wiping the windows, trying to earn the peace she'd been given. The bottom drawer of the old cabinet hadn't been opened in weeks, maybe months. It wasn't hers to open, but the dust had settled thick and stubborn, and something in her needed the distraction. She pulled again. The drawer gave. Inside, yellowed envelopes, a folded handkerchief, a dried corsage, and a photograph. Black and white. A young man in uniform, American, smiling, just barely. The grain of the paper made it hard to read the eyes, but the jawline was unmistakable. She had seen that face, its older echo, every morning across the breakfast table. It was the cowboy, but younger, stronger, and beside him another face, softer, slighter, same eyes. Her breath stopped. This was their son. She stared at the photograph until her hands shook. She didn't need anyone to explain. She already knew. He had gone to war, gone to the Pacific, gone to fight her, men like her, and he had not come back. Her first instinct was to put it back, to pretend she hadn't seen, but her fingers wouldn't move. The image held her, the weight of it, not just the life, but the loss, pressed against her like a hand to her chest. These people had lost a son, and yet they had taken her in, fed her, sheltered her, let their daughter draw pictures for the enemy. The air in the room changed, or maybe it was just her. A heaviness settled into her bones, into the corners of her breath. She replaced the photo gently, the same way one might lay down a folded flag. She shut the drawer with a care that bordered on reverence. That night at dinner, she moved a little slower. Her gaze dropped more often. Her words, already few, were fewer still. When the biscuits were passed, she took only one, but before sitting she hesitated. Then she turned back to the cowboy, placed another slice of bread on his plate, and returned to her seat without a word. He looked at it, then at her. Their eyes met for only a moment. And then he nodded. Once. It was nothing, and it was everything. They never spoke of it. She never said what she found. He never asked. But something passed between them that night, something beyond language, beyond borders, a shared ache, a recognition. She was not the only one who mourned. Grief didn't need translation. That night she lay awake, the image of the young man burned into her thoughts. She imagined what he had looked like in motion, his laugh, his stride, how his mother must have wept the day the letter came, how the little girl must have asked, over and over, why her brother wasn't coming home. She thought of her own brother, younger than her, who had vanished after the firebombing of their town. No one ever found the body. They assumed he was ash. She wondered, if someone like her had found his photograph in a drawer, would they have paused? Would they have cried? She did not feel forgiven. That would have been too much to ask. But she felt held, understood, not as a soldier, not even as a guest, but as a human being in mourning, one who carried the unbearable weight of survival. The garden outside her window rustled in the night wind. Somewhere a horse snorted softly in its stall. And in that silence she let herself grieve, not just for her country, not just for the war, but for all the lives folded quietly into drawers, lives remembered only in photographs, in glances, in slices of bread passed across the table. And for the first time she realized something deeper than fear or guilt. She was not alone in the remembering. By the time summer had turned the fields gold and dry, her skin had tanned beneath the prairie sun. Her hands, once delicate from surgical precision and calloused from war, now bore a new kind of roughness, honest, earned. She no longer startled at the clanging of pots, nor flinched when footsteps came up behind her. The barn had become her temple, the garden her prayer. She knew how long to knead the dough without looking at the clock. She had even begun to hum the Cowboys' favorite tune while stirring beans over the stove. Somewhere along the way she had begun to stand straighter, not from defiance, but from something closer to dignity. She wrote, "Now," in English, slowly, carefully. "I made bread," she scrawled in her notebook one day. "Today I smiled." The sentences were simple, but they were hers. She filled the pages with small truths, trying to preserve something of this quiet world before it slipped away. And then, one morning, the army jeep rolled up the dirt road. It was just like the day she had arrived. Sun high, dust rising, but everything else had changed. The soldier who stepped out was polite, distant, crisp in his uniform. He called her name. She didn't answer at first. The little girl ran to her, clutched her waist. "You have to go," the child whispered. She nodded. Her throat wouldn't let her speak. She packed in silence, folded each shirt, smoothed the corners of her borrowed life. When she reached the doorway, she paused. Her hand gripped the frame as though it might anchor her, as though this house, this odd, impossible home, could tether her to something she wasn't ready to leave behind. The cowboy stepped forward. He held out a small leather pouch. "Sewing needles," he said. "Figured you might need them." He didn't smile. He didn't say goodbye. Just those 3 words. "Don't forget us." Her lips parted, but nothing came. No thank you, no promise, only the sting in her eyes, the tightening in her chest. She took the pouch with both hands and bowed, low and deep, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, as a woman who had been broken and somehow here had begun to heal. The wife stood in the doorway, arms folded but eyes glistening. The little girl waved with both hands, shouting something the nurse couldn't hear over the engine. The horse in the paddock snorted and turned, indifferent to her departure. The garden, her corner, was still blooming. She climbed into the jeep, her knees stiff, her heart heavier than when she'd first arrived. As they pulled away, she didn't look back right away. She stared at her hands instead, dusty, lined, whole. When she finally turned to see the house disappearing behind her, it was already a memory. They returned her to camp like an item on a ledger. The gates clanged, the uniforms returned, but something was missing now. The fear that used to live in her chest had softened. The anger that once kept her silent had dulled. She was still a prisoner, but she was no longer defined by it. That night, under thin blankets and the smell of mildew, she opened the pouch. Inside, along with the needles, was a scrap of paper. On it, in careful handwriting, "You belong to the world now, not the war." She held it against her chest until sleep took her. If you're feeling this story so far, don't forget to like the video and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep sharing these forgotten voices. Morning in the camp hit harder than she remembered. The metal beds groaned. The air smelled of sweat, rust, and resignation. The walls, though the same as before, felt narrower now, as if they'd been dragged closer together in her absence. As she stepped through the gates, a few heads turned, then more. Her fellow prisoners looked at her not with joy, but with uncertainty. She felt it in their eyes, suspicion, curiosity, maybe even fear. She walked slower than she used to, not from weakness, but from something quieter, an awareness. Her hands didn't fidget, her posture didn't bow. She carried no uniform shame, no instinct to shrink, but she also didn't know where to sit anymore, what to say, or how to explain the time she'd spent on the other side of the wire in a house where someone baked cornbread just because they wanted to. One of the women, Aya, a former schoolteacher, approached her that afternoon, brushing dust from a folding stool. "You look different," she said. "Did they hurt you?" She shook her head. "No," she answered. "They let me live." She unwrapped the sewing needles first. Let them catch the light. "From the cowboy," she said softly. "He gave them to me." Aya stared, then frowned. "You're not making sense." Later that evening, under the watch of a guard whose gaze barely moved, she walked to a patch of hard soil near the fence and knelt. The earth was stubborn here, crusted from months without rain. Still, she pressed her fingers in, breaking through inch by inch. She dropped the seeds into the cracks. Her hand lingered. Then she covered them again, as if tucking in a child. Some of the women watched. Most turned away. That night, when the barracks dimmed and the murmurs rose, she told them about the girl with freckles and a stubborn pony, about the man who said little but never shouted, about the soft slap of bread dough on a wooden counter and a bedroom with curtains and a view. They listened, but not all believed. One woman hissed, "It was a trick. They wanted you to forget who you are." Another asked, "Did you beg for mercy? Did you cry for them?" A third just looked away, whispering, "They broke her." But Aya stayed, and one younger girl, Emiko, barely 16, asked, "Did you ride the horse?" She nodded. Emiko smiled. The next morning she braided Emiko's hair the way the cowboy's daughter had once braided hers. As her fingers moved, she felt a tremble in her chest. Not grief, not fear. Something else. Memory. Connection. A thread stretching backward and forward across impossible divides. But still, the fences loomed. She began to teach a few of the others to write in English. Nothing grand, just words. Sun, bread, hope. She sewed tiny pouches out of old linens, stuffing them with dried petals from weeds outside the fence. She told stories in fragments, unsure if they were even hers to tell anymore. Each time she did, she felt both lighter and lonelier, because something inside her had shifted. She was not the same. The world she had lived in, of honor and silence, of duty and death, no longer felt like home, and yet this place, this camp, was all that remained. The wind carried the scent of burned rice from the mess hall. A door slammed, a whistle blew. But in the corner of the yard, where the soil had been loosened, a single green shoot peeked through. She saw it, Emiko saw it too, and for a moment that was enough. It had to be. The ship docked in a harbor that barely resembled a country. She stepped off with a linen bag slung over her shoulder. Inside it, the pouch of needles, a folded letter, and a tin can with something rattling inside. Ash still clung to the edges of the streets. Her hometown, or what was left of it, was a skeleton of wood and memory. Cracked tiles, blackened walls, windows like hollow eyes. Her mother stood by the gate of a patched-up hut on the outskirts of the ruins. Older now, impossibly thin, her back bent like a question mark. She stared long and hard before saying her name, not with joy, not with disbelief, but with something closer to caution, as though unsure whether the person in front of her was really the daughter she had once kissed goodbye. They embraced stiffly. There were no tears, not yet, just the sound of distant hammers rebuilding something they could never fully restore. Inside, the silence was different. No radios, no English, just breath and the low murmur of wind through broken shutters. Her siblings, what few remained, kept glancing at her, like they didn't quite know where to place her. She smiled, but her smile felt foreign. She bowed, but her posture had changed. Even her voice seemed quieter now, though stronger. That night, as her family slept under patched futons in silence, she stepped outside and walked to the dry strip of earth behind the hut. She knelt, dug with her hands, pulled out the tin can and opened it carefully. Inside were the seeds, the same ones she'd planted once before behind a fence in a country that had been her enemy. She pressed them into the dirt. Then she waited. Days passed. Food was scarce, conversation scarcer. Her mother watched her from the doorway, saying little, until one morning something bloomed. Not much, just a small green shoot rising defiantly from the wreckage. When her mother saw it, she wept, not loudly, not in grief, but in a quiet, brittle way that suggested something had just broken open, or perhaps something had been mended. She never spoke of the cowboy, never mentioned the girl with freckles or the kitchen with warm bread. There was no room in their world for tales like that. Too strange, too far, too soft. Japan had been taught to forget its prisoners, especially those who came back changed. But one day, her daughter, barely old enough to write her own name, climbed into her lap and asked, "Mama, what did you do in the war?" She paused. Her hands, now steady and rough with life, rested on the child's small shoulders. She didn't speak of battles, or hunger, or camps. Instead, she said, "Once the enemy made me feel human again." Her daughter blinked. "Was that bad?" "No," she whispered. "It saved me." Years later, she still stitched fabric with the cowboy's needles. She still had the letter she never sent, now yellowed and creased at the corners, and every spring, behind the hut, the seeds bloomed. No one asked where they came from. They were just there, like scars, like memories, like silent revolutions growing in the shadows of old pain. She didn't fight a war with guns, but she had fought against hate, against silence, against forgetting, and she had won. If this story moved you, please like and share it, and let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? These forgotten voices deserve to be heard.